Jake Reynolds had always loved the solitude of the Montana wilderness. The crisp air, the towering pines, the distant call of an eagle soaring overhead. It was the kind of silence that made a man feel both free and insignificant. But on that particular morning, the silence was broken. It started as a faint, almost indistinguishable sound over the rush of the river. A high-pitched whimper, barely audible beneath the crashing water. At first, Jake thought he was imagining it. But then he heard it again, desperate, struggling, alive. He stepped closer to the riverbank, scanning the surface of the churning rapids. And then he saw it. A small, dark shape bobbed in the icy water, tossed mercilessly by the current. It wasn't a log. It was moving, thrashing, drowning. Instinct took over. Jake didn't stop to think. He dropped his pack, kicked off his boots, and dove in. The cold was a brutal shock, stealing the air from his lungs as the river pulled him under. He fought against the current, strokes powerful but uneven, his eyes locked on the tiny form being carried downstream. He pushed harder, ignoring the sting in his muscles, the ache in his chest. A final lunge, and his hands closed around wet fur. The creature let out a weak, gasping cry as Jake hauled it against his chest. Small, frail, but still alive. Using the last of his strength, he fought his way back to shore, dragging himself and the half-drowned animal onto the muddy bank. He collapsed, panting, the adrenaline finally catching up to him. For a moment, neither of them moved. The world was nothing but the sound of the river roaring behind them, his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. Then, he looked down. The creature in his arms was trembling violently, soaked to the bone. It was young, too young. Maybe only a few weeks old. Dark gray fur clung to its tiny frame, and when it opened its eyes, Jake's breath caught. Golden. Wild. Not a dog. A wolf. Jake swallowed hard, instincts warring in his head. He knew exactly what this was. A gray wolf pup, barely old enough to fend for itself. And if it had been swept into the river alone, that meant one of two things. Either its pack had been nearby, or it had been abandoned. If it was the former, he was in trouble. Wolves were fiercely protective of their young. If a mother wolf returned and found a human with her pup, there would be no reasoning with her. Jake glanced around, scanning the thick tree line. Nothing. No movement, no sign of other wolves. Just the wind shifting through the evergreens and the rhythmic rush of the river. He looked back down at the pup. Its tiny body shuddered against him, too weak to move. It wouldn't last long in this condition. Not alone, not in the cold. Jake let out a slow breath. He knew what he should do. Walk away. Let nature take its course. It wasn't his responsibility. It wasn't his problem. And yet, something in those eyes held him there. A silent plea. A flicker of trust, or maybe desperation. Jake muttered a curse under his breath. He was going to regret this. He just knew it. But even as he told himself that, he was already pulling off his jacket, wrapping the pup in the warm fabric. Then, with a sigh that felt like surrender, he stood and started back toward his cabin, carrying the fragile life he had just saved. Having no idea that this moment, this choice, would change everything. The pup barely stirred on the walk back to Jake's cabin. Wrapped tightly in his flannel jacket, it was little more than a trembling bundle of wet fur. Its breathing was shallow, uneven, and far too weak for comfort. Jake picked up his pace. His cabin sat in a clearing about a mile from the river, just a modest structure of wood and stone, built with his own hands. He pushed through the door, kicking it shut behind him, and carried the pup straight to the fireplace. The air inside was warm, thick with the scent of burnt wood and pine. Moving quickly, Jake grabbed a thick towel, peeling his jacket away from the tiny body. The wolf let out a weak whimper as the cold air hit its damp fur. "Easy now," Jake murmured, surprised at how naturally the words came. He wasn't the type to talk to animals. He'd spent most of his life in solitude, preferring the company of the mountains over people. But there was something about the pup, something fragile, something that shouldn't have survived but did. And now, for better or worse, it was his responsibility. He started rubbing the towel gently over the pup's body, careful not to be too rough. Underneath the thick fur, he could feel ribs. It was too thin, underfed. It must have been struggling even before it ended up in the river. How long had it been alone? More importantly, why? Grey wolves were pack animals, fiercely protective of their young. A pup this small should have never been on its own. Which meant only one of two things. Either its mother was dead, or it had been abandoned. Neither possibility sat well with him. The pup whimpered again, barely lifting its head before it collapsed back into the towel. Its eyes were half-lidded, struggling to stay open. "You're tougher than you look," Jake muttered. He knew enough about animals to recognize that this little one should have been dead. The river should have taken it. The cold should have drained the last of its strength. But here it was, hanging on, refusing to give up. That kind of fight. Jake could respect it. Once the pup was dry, he wrapped it in an old fleece blanket and set it in front of the fireplace. He didn't have much in terms of food for a baby wolf. Hell, he wasn't even sure what it could eat. He'd seen documentaries about wolf pups feeding on regurgitated meat from their mothers, but that wasn't exactly an option. Milk, then. It made sense. He had some left over from his last trip into town, but would that even be enough? Jake sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. He wasn't prepared for this. He had no business taking in a wild animal. And yet, when he looked over at the tiny creature curled up in the blanket, its breathing finally steadying, he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going to let it die. Hours passed. The pup stirred only once, blinking up at him with those striking golden eyes before slipping back into exhaustion. Jake fed it small amounts of milk, careful not to overwhelm its tiny stomach. It drank weakly, but it drank. That was a good sign. The storm outside had rolled in faster than expected, wind howling through the trees, snow already dusting the window panes. If he'd left the pup out there, even if it had survived the river, it wouldn't have lasted the night. Yeah, he'd done the right thing. But as he sat back in his chair, watching the little wolf sleep soundly by the fire, a thought gnawed at him. What if there were others? What if he hadn't saved a lone pup, but stolen a mother's cub? And what if, somewhere out there in the darkness, something bigger, something fiercer, was already looking for him? Mark's arms trembled as he clung to the half-submerged tree, his breath coming in sharp, ragged gasps. His body was frozen to the core, every muscle screaming from the brutal fight against the current. But he had made it. They had made it. The wolf lay sprawled across the log beside him, its soaked fur clinging to its ribs, each breath labored and shallow. It didn't move. Not to flee. Not to attack. Just existed. Mark swallowed hard, trying to ignore the pounding in his skull. He had just risked his life to save an animal that, under different circumstances, wouldn't have hesitated to tear him apart. What the hell was he thinking? The river still roared beneath them, crashing against the log like a beast unwilling to surrender its prey. But for now, they were out of its grasp. Mark forced himself to move, wincing as his fingers, numb and stiff, dug into the bark for support. His soaked clothes clung to him like ice, the weight of exhaustion pressing down on his chest. He turned his head slightly, just enough to see the wolf better. And that's when it happened. The wolf opened its eyes. Golden. Piercing. Watching him. A shiver ran down Mark's spine, not from the cold, but from something deeper. Instinct. This was no pet, no tamed creature grateful for its rescue. This was a wild predator, honed by survival, governed by laws far older than any human could comprehend. And right now, it was looking at him, truly seeing him, as if deciding what he was. A threat? A savior? A fool? Mark's pulse pounded in his ears. The wolf's breath came slow and deliberate now, its muscles coiled beneath its wet fur. Was it too weak to attack? Or just waiting for the right moment? His body tensed, his instincts screaming at him to move, to run, but there was nowhere to go. If he tried to escape too fast, he'd slip, fall back into the river, and this time, he wouldn't make it out. If he stayed too long, the wolf could recover, and then what? Slowly, carefully, Mark shifted his weight. His hand inched toward a thicker part of the log, his fingers searching for better leverage. The wolf's ears twitched, its nostrils flaring slightly. It was watching his every move, testing him. Then, just as Mark braced himself for the inevitable, the snarl, the lunge, the teeth, something unexpected happened. The wolf blinked. Not in aggression. Not in warning. In exhaustion. Its head dropped slightly, its breathing steady but strained. Mark realized then, it wasn't just weak. It was done. It had nothing left to fight with. The relief was short-lived. They weren't safe yet. The log wasn't a permanent refuge. They needed to get to dry land before the cold set in for good. Mark exhaled, forcing his voice steady. "All right, big guy," he murmured, unsure if he was talking to the wolf or himself. "Let's not kill each other just yet." No reaction. Just the steady rise and fall of the wolf's chest, the way its body subtly leaned against the bark as if anchoring itself to reality. Mark swallowed, shifting carefully. His limbs felt like lead, but he couldn't stop now. The shore was close. He just had to make it, and hope the wolf would let him. The days passed, turning into weeks. What had started as a rescue had become something else entirely. Shadow was no longer the weak, half-drowned pup Jake had pulled from the river. He was stronger now, more alert. His legs had grown sturdier, his frame filling out with each meal. He could move swiftly, his once clumsy paws now steady on the wooden floor of the cabin. And his instincts, those were sharper than ever. At first, Jake had treated Shadow like an orphan pet, feeding him carefully, making sure he was warm and safe. But the pup had never been just a pet. That much was clear now. He stalked insects with quiet precision, his ears twitching at every sound outside. He didn't bark like a dog, he was silent when he moved, watching everything with an intensity that felt ancient, primal. But more than anything, Shadow was restless. Jake noticed it most at night. The way the pup would sit by the door, staring at the cracks in the wood, his ears perked at sounds Jake couldn't hear. Sometimes, he'd let out a soft, questioning whine. Not sad, not fearful, just expectant. Like he was waiting for something. Or someone. Jake ignored it at first. He told himself Shadow was just curious about the world beyond the cabin walls. That it was normal for an animal raised in the wild to want to be back in it. But deep down, he knew better. Shadow wasn't meant to stay here. And sooner or later, Jake would have to let him go. One evening, as the sun dipped below the tree lean, casting golden light over the clearing, Jake sat on the cabin's porch, sipping a beer. Shadow lay beside him, his thick fur brushing against Jake's boot. The two of them sat in silence, listening to the sounds of the wilderness. Then it happened. A long, echoing howl rang out through the trees. Low. Haunting. Shadow's ears perked instantly. His entire body stiffened. Jake knew that howl. It wasn't just any wolf, it was a call. A summons. Shadow rose to his feet, his muscles tense beneath his growing frame. His golden eyes flickered to Jake, then back toward the woods. Jake swallowed, setting his drink down. "Well," he murmured, "guess it's time, huh?" Shadow didn't move. He stood there, caught between two worlds. Between the man who had saved him and the wild that had called him home. Jake took a deep breath. He had always known this moment would come. But that didn't make it any easier. Slowly, he reached down, giving Shadow one last scratch behind the ears. "Go on, boy," he said, his voice quieter now. "You belong out there." For the first time since they met, Shadow hesitated. Then, with a final glance, he turned toward the trees. And ran. Jake watched until the last trace of gray fur disappeared into the shadows. The night air felt heavier now, the silence louder. And for the first time in a long while, Jake realized he was alone again. But as he stood there, listening to the distant howls of wolves in the hills, he couldn't help but wonder. Had he lost Shadow forever? Or was this just the beginning of something else? The cabin felt different without Shadow. Jake had never been the sentimental type, but the silence weighed on him in a way he hadn't expected. The space by the fireplace, where Shadow used to curl up, was empty. The scratches on the wooden floor, once an annoyance, now felt like the last remnants of something that had passed too quickly. It had been weeks since Shadow left. Jake told himself he had done the right thing. Wolves weren't meant to live in cabins. They weren't meant to be tamed. But that didn't stop him from listening. Every night, he sat on the porch with a beer in hand, ears tuned to the distant sounds of the forest. He had never paid much attention to the howls before. Now, he listened for one in particular. And then, one night it happened. A long, familiar howl cut through the cold air, closer than ever before. Jake's heart pounded. He knew that sound. Shadow. Jake set his drink down and stood, scanning the treeline. The moonlight illuminated the frost-covered branches, casting long shadows across the clearing. The howl came again, steady, confident. Not the whimper of a lost pup, but the call of something stronger. And then, from the darkness, movement. A shape emerged from the trees, larger than before, no longer the frail pup he had carried from the river. Shadow had grown. His frame was leaner, his muscles more defined. His fur, thick and full, glowed silver under the moonlight. But he wasn't alone. Behind him, shifting in the darkness, were others. Yellow eyes glowed like embers in the treeline. A pack. Jake exhaled slowly, his fingers instinctively tightening at his sides. This wasn't the same Shadow he had nursed back to health. This was a wolf in his element, standing at the head of his kind. Shadow took a step forward. The others stayed back, watching. For a long moment, neither moved. Then, to Jake's surprise, Shadow lowered his head. Not submission. Not weakness. Something else. Recognition. Jake's throat tightened. He had expected Shadow to forget him, to return as nothing more than another wild creature, indifferent to the man who had saved him. But Shadow remembered. Jake took a slow step forward, stopping just at the edge of the porch. "Hey, boy," he murmured. Shadow's ears twitched, his tail shifting slightly, not wagging, but not aggressive either. A neutral stance. A moment passed between them, silent but full of meaning. Then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, Shadow turned. With one last look over his shoulder, he let out a short, commanding huff. And the pack disappeared into the night. Jake stood there long after they were gone, his breath rising in the cold air. Shadow had come back. Not as a lost pup. Not as a pet. But as something greater. And Jake had the strange feeling that this wasn't the last time their paths would cross. Not by a long shot. Winter in the Montana wilderness was ruthless. The kind of cold that didn't just bite, it sank into your bones and refused to let go. Jake had lived through enough of them to know the rules. Stay prepared, stay alert, and never take unnecessary risks. But one mistake, just one, could turn deadly. And tonight, he had made one. The snowfall had started earlier in the day, light at first, nothing to worry about. But by evening, the wind had picked up, and the temperature had plummeted. Jake had been out checking his traps a few miles from the cabin, intending to be back before dark. But the storm had come faster than expected. Now he was lost. The snow was thick, swirling violently in the wind, reducing visibility to nearly nothing. The usual landmarks, the fallen pine, the jagged rock formation, were buried beneath drifts of white. Every direction looked the same. Jake clenched his jaw, adjusting the rifle slung across his back. He had been walking for what felt like hours, but the cold was sinking deeper, slowing him down. His fingers were numb even inside his gloves. His breaths came sharp and ragged. If he didn't find shelter soon, he wasn't going to make it. Then, through the storm, movement. At first, he thought it was his mind playing tricks on him. A shadow shifting between the trees. But then he heard it. A low, familiar huff. Jake froze, his heart hammering in his chest. And then he saw them. A group of figures emerging from the white, silent as ghosts. Wolves. At their head, a large gray wolf stood tall, his golden eyes locking onto Jake's. Shadow. Jake exhaled sharply, disbelief washing over him. The pack moved in closer, but they didn't snarl. They didn't lunge. Shadow took a step forward, sniffing the air. Then, as if making a decision, he turned, walking a few paces before stopping to look back. He wanted Jake to follow. Jake didn't hesitate. He pushed forward through the snow, his legs heavy, his breath labored. The wolves moved ahead of him, gliding through the storm with ease. Shadow stayed closest, glancing back every so often, making sure Jake was keeping up. Minutes passed. Maybe longer. Time felt strange in the cold. Then, suddenly, the trees opened up, and there it was. A small overhang of rock, shielded from the worst of the wind. A natural shelter. Jake staggered forward, collapsing onto his knees beneath the cover. His body was shaking violently, the first warning signs of hypothermia settling in. He fumbled to get his pack off, pulling out a lighter with stiff fingers. It took 3 tries before he got a flame. The fire flickered to life, casting warm light against the stone. When Jake looked up, Shadow was still there. The rest of the pack lingered at the tree line, watching, waiting. But Shadow didn't move. For the longest moment, man and wolf simply looked at each other. Then, as if satisfied, Shadow huffed softly. And he was gone. Jake sat back, watching as the wolves vanished into the storm, their shapes dissolving into the snow. He let out a slow breath, his chest tightening with something unspoken. Shadow had saved him. Not as a pet. Not as a stray pup who needed help. But as an equal. As family. And deep down, Jake knew, wherever Shadow was, whatever path he walked in the wild, he would always be watching. And maybe, just maybe, he would return again. When the time was right.